Haidong. In this video, we're going to talk about cutting towards the close versus the open. You know I like transparency, so those terms came from somewhere. Unfortunately, I do not remember the exact place. It is probably a HEMA source, just because that's where I get a lot of my application and kind of that mindset from. So it's probably from one of those places. But what do I mean by cutting towards the open versus the close? A quick test is if you're cutting and your blade ends up towards your front knee, it's probably the close. As an example, right? So if we have our happy little diagonal cut, right? So if we're up here, starting off with a nice little high guard, if I'm going to be cutting towards my knee here, this is going to be cutting towards the close. So kind of the reason why it's called the close is I'm a little more closed off, right? So I'm a smaller target here, and I'm also covering a little bit more of the side here if I need to. So this is cutting towards the close, versus the open is, again, the shortcut is if I'm cutting and my knee's not in the way, it is probably going to be towards the open. So if I take the same kind of move and I step forward with this one, notice that I'm a little bit of a bigger target. My sword is not where my knee is, and this is a little more open. So let me show you a quick combination. So again, this, for full transparency, is a combination actually taught by Sword Carolina. I'll have their information in the doobly-doo. They're an excellent source to actually do some online training if you need to do some online training. So this combination is hitting more or less the four major openings, right? So Gumdo kind of has a fifth, right? Because we have a lot more center cuts than HEMA has for these other four quadrants. But I'm going to do the same combination. One of them is cutting towards the close, and the other one will be cutting towards the open. So let's first just see what that would be, right? So from here, we'll be cutting towards the close. I'll also do it facing this way so you have a better idea, right? So from here, pop, 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 pop. Make sense? Cutting towards open would look more like this. Likewise. So from here, cutting towards the open. Makes sense? So a few things I want to note, having looked at that combination, right, are a few major differences, right? So the cuts were the same, but you probably noticed the stances were a little bit different. And that's sort of on purpose. So if you compare, and we're going to do this in a future video, but compare Gumdo versus HEMA, for example, the footwork is a little bit different. You're going to notice when I was cutting towards the close, I used what in Gumdo we call sorose, or the short stance. We're kind of coming in here, right? Using that back foot to kind of counterbalance. Versus when we were doing the long step, right? So the cutting towards the open, I mostly ended up in what's called terose, or the long stance, which is what you should call long stance, was a lot longer. This is also more standard in what you see in HEMA as well. So one question might be like, okay, so there's that difference, why, right? Both cutting towards the close and the open are both good. But you just need to think about what is the pros and cons, right? So just like with anything else, with a sword's a sword, so it should really work for either style. So one reason that you would probably do a closed cut is it is going to be a little bit faster. So the reason for that is both a boon and not a boon. So part of it is that you have a slightly smaller range. However, you're also going to be using your stance to kind of speed things up a little bit more. So if I kind of break down the mechanics a little bit, I'm actually going to have the other foot forward. So stepping forward in both of them. So if I'm here, so if I cut towards the close and I step forward with that cut, you're going to notice the back foot is the one that helps synchronize the cut, right? So if we really slow it down, right, we're here. So this is true for Gumdo and to a lesser extent other martial arts, right? you actually land your front foot first a little bit before the cut finishes. It's here, and the back foot comes in for the cut. So likewise, as we go into the next move, plant, cut, plant, cut, plant, cut. So it's not intended to be stance first, sword later. It's supposed to be about the same time, but in actuality, that's usually how it shows up. So we usually plant our foot a little bit before the sword really starts to move forward, and then we use the back foot to use that as a counterbalance. So, but notice as we cut, it's really as far as I can step. So this is pretty much as long as I could step with it. I'm probably going to step a little bit shorter than that. So a little bit shorter step, that seems like a bad idea, but the boon of it is it's going to be faster, right? So because these cuts are going to be a little more stable, so just from a physics perspective, right? If I'm cutting towards the close, the horizontal vector of my diagonal cut is going to be absorbed by my foot. So just by having that here to absorb this way, to kind of go the equal and opposite, I'm going to be more stable as an individual unit, as opposed to if I cut with my body, everything is, so there's nothing kind of resist the horizontal motion this way, so everything is going here. So it is a more stable cut, so that means it's a lot easier to move from one stance to the next, right? So you can easily cut, 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 and keep moving, which is very traditional in the Korean style, right? We like to throw a bunch of cuts. One of them's gotta land, right? Versus if you cut towards the open, it usually takes a little bit more time, in my case, because I'm not as practiced, a lot more time to cut between those cuts. So when we cut towards the open, so first of all, notice the difference in the distance you can gain. So from here, if I have to step with my cut, I get a lot more of a distance with each cut, but for me it takes a little bit longer, right? So from here, right, with each cut. So I was able to almost comfortably do all 4 cuts with the closed step, but now I'm kind of pressed for space with a long step. Another thing to keep in mind is the timing of the cut, so the synchrony of the cut. So I'm gonna mix everything together. So a term that I really like for synchrony is kiken taiichi, right? So that's something that I've taken from kendo. So yeah, another person I have to reference is going to be, it's about a church sensei from Rutgers. Kiken taiichi was about, well, ki, breathing, ken, sword, tai, body, ichi, one motion. So all those 3 motions, right? So the sword moving forward, my body moving forward, my exhalation, all should be synchronized to a point. In practice, maybe not so much, right? But that's the idea behind it. So to really show off the differences, so with the closed cut, what usually happens, again, I already mentioned this, is you usually, so tai, right? So the body is a fraction earlier, right? But everything ends the same time. So body starts first, so it kind of like has that initiation, sword, and I'm starting to exhale, but as everything closes in, right, everything is closed in at the same time. So kiken taiichi is true for the very end, but not with the initiation of the motion. Versus if we take a look at the long cut, or sorry, the open cut, right, cutting towards the open. So this is more of a HEMA thing. So I've learned this, I think, both from my instructor in Reading as well as other HEMA folk. The idea is you want to start with your weapon. Because the idea behind it is if my sword is already forward, they already have to deal with that. So the idea is the sword, so the ken in this case, so the sword is moving first, and my body is going to compensate for that motion. So that timing is going to be a little bit different. So you're probably going to notice it's still going to end about the same, but the sword is going to be really initiating the cut, and you're going to be able to absorb that momentum with this grander, bigger step. So the question might be, what should I do, right? So we have these two things, right? And one might be better to your style, one might be more familiar to you, but they both seem to have pros and cons. Which one should you do? Ultimately, it depends on the context and sometimes the equipment that you use. So in Gumdo, the vast majority of the cuts are closed cuts with a few notable exceptions, right? But again, that matches the style. So long as you know why you would do a closed cut, right? So ending in a closed position is a little bit better from a defensive perspective, right? So if I'm here and I cut and like, oh no, I have to defend, I'm already having most of my body kind of behind my sword. I can like quickly, if I want to do like a really weak block there, or really block a little bit more effectively from a different position, as opposed to if I cut towards the open, my sword is way out here, it would take effort to bring it back in, potentially for a more powerful block. It would take time to do so. So cutting towards the open and defending from the open are more powerful. They're a lot more specialized, but it takes a little bit longer, as opposed to cutting towards the close is going to be faster, not as powerful, right? You can still get awesome power from it, but it's not going to be like maximized power. So ultimately, it's all going to be about, first of all, the martial art that you're practicing. Also depends on your own fighting style, because even someone who practices Gumdo quite a lot can love cutting towards the open. Someone who practices Hema a lot can still love cutting to the close. It really doesn't matter. So long as you train it, drill it, make sure you understand why you do it. So it was a little bit more of a lecture-y kind of thing, but hopefully that made sense. So make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training. Haidong!